What's up, everyone? I hope you guys are doing well. I'm back here again with another video for the solutions to the IB Economics Higher Level Paper 3. This is the 2022 paper, the October/November paper. I should say. I should be specific. And in this video, I'm going to go through the solutions to the second question. So in the previous video, I'd done question 1. So if you want to check out question 1 of this paper, then check out the previous video. But in this video, as I said, we're going to go through the solutions to the second question. Now, this is paper 3, and you only have to answer one question, right? So you don't have to do both, right? So this is as I said, I've done solutions to the second one. I'm just going to skip forward to the first one. I'm just going to skip forward to the second question, which begins over here. Okay, so let's just dive into it. So in this question, we're told here that figure 2 illustrates the daily world price of wheat in US dollars per kilo from August 2002 to February 2021. Okay, so what do we have here? Got this little picture, and the picture shows us the price in US dollars per kilogram of I believe it is wheat, right? So yeah, price of wheat in US dollars. This is dollars per kilo. Okay, so and this is what we call time series graph. It kind of shows us the price of wheat over time. So you can see on the horizontal axes, we've got everything from August 2002 to February 2021, and then up here we've got the price of wheat is fluctuating, it's going up and down. Okay, so cool picture. What do we have to do with this? So part part 1, part 1. It's simply asking us to describe the information shown in figure 2. So here, it's only worth 2 marks. So yeah, just describe whatever you see. So if you go back up to the picture, if I would just tell you, what can you tell me about this picture? What can you see? Well, I suppose the first thing that you might say is there appears to be what we call volatility in wheat prices. So volatility means this thing is going to bounce up and down. It doesn't always stay the same price. Sometimes it's a little bit expensive and sometimes it's a little bit cheaper, right? So, for example, if you look over here in this period in October 2022, it's way higher than it was down here in December 2020, right? So we've got these price spikes, this volatility in the prices goes up and down. The second thing I would probably mention is that we can see this kind of general upward trend where at least over this particular period from August 2020 to February 2021, the wheat prices are rising. And and the other thing I would probably mention, if you want just extra points as well, is I would say, look, there seems to be a couple of price peaks over here and over here. So the price kind of does spike. That first one is October 2020, and that second one is Jan 2021. So let's go ahead and we'll sort of, put some words to that. So down here I've written, the first thing we can see is we have volatility. Wheat prices are volatile, ranging from $4.90 to $6.70, which is about a 35% range, I guess, over a 6-month period. So that's the first thing I'll mention. The second thing I will say is that there appears to be an upward trend. So prices have risen over the period. And the very last thing I'll say is that, as I mentioned before, there seem to be these price peaks. So prices peaked around October and January, which is from, we saw that from the graph above. So as I said, this is a 2 mark. You'll probably get just 1 mark for describing each one thing. So here, if you want to, just have a backup, I would say make 3, even 4 observations. So therefore, if one's kind of not super correct, you've got the other 2 to back you up. Okay, nothing too fancy there. Let's just move on to the next question. Okay, so here, part 2, a little bit more meaty. On the 17th of December 2020, Turkey eliminated a 20% tariff it had imposed on wheat imports from Russia. Russia had recently decided to introduce a tax on its wheat exports. Turkey is the largest flour exporter in the world, and Turkish flour exporters buy 85% of the wheat they need in their production process from Russia. So what do we have to do? Well, over here, part 2, using figure 2 and the information above, explain 2 reasons that may account for Turkey's decision to eliminate the 20% tariff on wheat imports from Russia. Okay, so what's happening? What's happening is Turkey used to have this 20% tariff on wheat imports, meaning that if you were in Turkey and you wanted to import, if you wanted to bring in, let's say, a ton of wheat from Russia, you would have to pay tax on that import. That is what's known as a tariff, right? Tariff is simply a fancy word for a tax on an import. So what this does is that it makes the wheat more expensive in Turkey compared to Russia and potentially other parts of the world, because the government is slapping this 20% tax on every unit, every kilo, every ton of wheat that comes into the country from Russia. They're slapping this 20% tax on top of that. Now, what they had done is that on the 17th of December 2020, they eliminated, right? They got rid of this 20% tax. Now, explain two reasons why they may have done so, right? Like, why would Turkey remove this tax if the Turkish government is collecting tax revenue? Like, why would they get rid of it? Okay, I can think of at least two reasons. So the first one here is this idea of international competitiveness. So you might want to reduce, if you reduce the tariff, then you reduce the, okay, sorry, I should backtrack a little bit. The second part of the story we're told is that Turkey is the largest flour exporter in the world. So what do we need to make flour? Well, we need wheat, right? Wheat is a raw material or raw ingredient into the manufacture of flour. So if you're exporting flour, and if you remove the tax, well, if you have a tax on the raw material, then that's going to make that ultimate thing that you sell, let's say the flour, is going to be more expensive, right? Because the Turkish flour manufacturers have to take into account that 20% tariff, and they have to pass that cost on to the final consumer. If you take away that tariff, then you're going to remove that cost, and they can then pass on the cost savings. So that's going to improve international competitiveness. So here I'd say something like wheat prices rose by 35% in 6 months. Wheat is a key input to the manufacture of flour. Since Turkey exports flour, higher wheat prices makes Turkish flour more expensive and less competitive. Therefore, removing the tariff reduces the price and improves competitiveness, right? So this is one reason why the government might want to remove that tariff, is to help the Turkish flour manufacturers compete more aggressively in world markets. So that's the first reason. Right, let's get rid of that highlighting. Now, another reason I mentioned is this can also help reduce inflation, right? So reducing inflation. Wheat is a key input into many food products, for example, bread. Rising wheat prices translates to higher food prices, resulting in this thing called cost push inflation. Removing the tariff helps reduce this effect. So if your country has this inflation issue, so if inflation, by the way, I'm hoping you guys know what inflation is. Inflation refers to this situation where, the price of stuff and things just becomes more expensive. Now, if stuff and things is becoming more expensive faster than your rate of wage growth, then you're going to have a problem, right? Because now people can't afford to buy the daily necessities that they need. For example, food, bread and all that sort of thing. So you want to combat this. You want to prevent this inflation problem from, becoming a problem. One way to do that is to take off the tariff. If you take off the tariff, then as we discussed before, that creates these cost savings, and the cost savings can be passed on to the consumer. So things like bread and all the other things that come from wheat, your pasta, your noodles, or whatever other things that they use wheat for, these things all become cheaper, and that will help to combat inflation. So the second reason I should say, as to why the Turkish government might want to remove that 20% tariff is to reduce inflation. All right, that's it. Let's move on. Now, more on the Turkish wheat market. So figure 3 illustrates the Turkish wheat market. Before the 20% tariff was eliminated, the price for wheat in Turkey was US $7.20 per kilogram, S is the domestic supply, D is the domestic demand, SW is world supply, and ST is the world supply with the tariff, right? So if we look down on this picture over here, we see, can't squeeze everything in. Let me just try to get this thing. Well, yeah, there you go. It's kind of mostly in the shot. Right, so what we have here is you got a regular O supply and we have a demand, right? So we're used to seeing this. And on the vertical axis, we've got the price of wheat in US dollars per kilogram, and this is the quantity per month that's being traded in millions of kilograms, right? So this is really important. We need to make a note of this millions of kilograms, because in a second that's going to affect some of our revenue calculations. We have to remember this thing is scaled to millions, right? So if we had like 30, that's not 30 kilograms, that's 30 million kilograms. So we just got to be aware of that. Okay, so apart from that, we've got our supply and demand curve, and then we have this thing called SW. You might see this thing over here. That is the world supply curve. So the reason why the world supply curve is perfectly flat or perfectly elastic, by the way, is to kind of recognize this fact that from the point of view of Turkey, because they're a small country, from their point of view, the world supply is infinite at this price, right? So the world, because Turkey is a small country relative to the entire world, from their point of view, it might as well be an effectively infinite supply curve, right? The world can supply as much or as little wheat to this particular country at $6 per kilo, and it's not going to change, like what Turkey does or doesn't do is not going to change that world price at all. They can't make a dent in the world prices. Then ST represents the world supply with the tariff on. So remember, Turkey had slapped that 20% tariff, and by putting the 20% tariff, that ends up raising the price of wheat. Okay, so let's move on to the actual question. So question part 3, I should say, is telling us to use figure 3 to calculate the change in social/community surplus that resulted from the elimination of the 20% tariff. Okay, so I'll just cut straight to the chase. The main benefit that society / community, whatever, gets from the removal of the tariff is this thing called the deadweight loss. Or rather, if I put it the other way around, when you put a tariff on, you create these inefficiencies called deadweight losses. So if you remove the tariff, you undo the tariff, you're going to undo those deadweight losses. Now, deadweight loss in the diagram above is represented over here. I've done it using the triangle A and the triangle B. Now, I'll just quickly explain to you why these things are deadweight losses and why they're considered to be a net loss to society. Let's say, just trying to figure out what color to use here. Let's say if we had if we were able to import wheat at world prices, which is $6 per kilogram, consumer surplus would be equal to this big sort of large triangle over here, and that incorporates this that big triangle that I've got shaded. When you impose the tariff, what's going to happen is that world supply is going to move from that world supply curve is going to go from SW to ST, T for tariff, and as a result, consumer surplus is going to shrink into this kind of smaller triangle. Now, so the amount of surplus that consumers have lost is this kind of weird looking, and I'm kind of exaggerating this, by the way. They kind of lose that sort of weird kind of trapezoid looking area. Out of this weird sort of trapezoid looking area, this chunk is what we call the redistributive effect. It is the slice of consumer surplus that is redistributed to local producers as a result of the tariff. So the local Turkish wheat producers are able to gain this slice from consumer surplus. Now, we do not consider this redistributive effect to be a net loss to society, because all we're doing is we're taking the consumer surplus and transferring it from the consumers to the producers. So it's not really a net loss. This other rectangle over here, that's what we call the tax effect. Now that tax bit, that's the redistribution or the transfer of consumers from consumer surplus to the government, because the government is going to be collecting taxes on every kilo of wheat that's imported. So that rectangle is a transfer. So once again, it is not a net loss to society because it is simply a transfer from consumers, in this case, to the government. The bits that we can account for are those two little triangles, A and B, right? And as it turns out, those two little triangles, A and B, they don't go to anyone. They're simply eaten up. They're simply disappeared through the taxes. We call that, you think about it as like an efficiency loss from the fact that we have these taxes. And so we call that efficiency loss a dead weight loss. So, which is why I've annotated those two little areas A and B to be dead weight losses in this diagram. Now, so what we're saying is that if you put that tax on, you're going to incur A and B in dead weight losses. But if you remove the tax, well, you're going to go back to what the world price was, which is $6, and you're going to regain those areas A and B, which are those dead weight losses. So to answer the question, the change in social/community surplus would be those dead weight losses, right? We don't count the redistribution effect and the tax effects because, as I said, that's just a redistribution from one sector to another. So here I've said something like dead weight loss from the tariff is depicted by areas A and B in the diagram above. Removing the tariff allows society to regain these areas, which is equal to 3.6 by 2, right? Which is 7.2 million US dollars. Now, if you want to see the calculation, it's just below here. So area A is basically that little triangle, the left triangle, and the way we calculate the area of a triangle is we go half base times height. And actually, you know what? I'll just quickly show you. I'm sure you guys know what it is, but if we had to sort of explain this, we would say, okay, this, I'm going to do like a little side thing over here, right? Just to blow it up, just to zoom it in a little bit. So this triangle, if you notice, it has a base of, so that number there is 32, 34, 36, I think. Yeah, 36. So we got 36 over there, and we've got 30 over on the left-hand side. That means that the base of this triangle would be 6, and the height of the triangle would be over here. If we got like 720 minus 6, so that's going to be like $7.20, and we got like $6. So the height would be $1.20, which is 720 minus 6, and so that's where we get this area from. That's where we've got this little calculation. So if we whip out the calculator, by the way. Clear? So I was to go, if I go 0.5 times, now let's say open bracket, oops, where's my bracket? There it is. 36 minus 30, and we're going to close the bracket, times like 1.2, that's going to go 3.6. So there you go. So we got $3.6 million for the first bit for area A. And don't forget, we need to have area B as well. Now, B happens to be the same as A because, as you can see from the diagram, A and B are the same. They're just flipped, right? They're symmetrical. That one is just the mirror image of the other. So since we only care about the area, we don't really care about the left or right. B is also going to have the same area as A, which is 3.6 million. So if you add those 3.6 million from A to the 3.6 million from B, you end up with 7.2 million, which is the total amount of deadweight loss, which is how much the country would regain if you were to remove these tariffs. All good? Okay, let's move on. Okay, so question 2, part 4. The currency of Turkey is the Turkish lira. If 1 Turkish lira is equal to 13.4 US cents, using figure 3, calculate in Turkish lira the change in the monthly total revenue of Turkish wheat producers as a result of the elimination of the 20% tariff. Okay, so what we have to do is we need to figure out how this tariff is going to affect the revenue of the wheat producers in Turkey. So to do that, I'm going to figure out, well, we have to calculate the total revenue before the removal of the tariff and after. And then we just simply look at the difference between those two figures, and that's going to give us the change in revenue that the producers experience, right? And then lastly, we're going to convert that delta, that change in US dollars into Turkish lira. All right, so just to go back to the diagram over here. Now, the way, let me just get rid of this ink, we don't need it right now. Okay, so the way we do this is we say, I'm going to use a couple of different colors. I'll start off by using blue. So before the elimination of the tariff, Turkish producers are producing 36 tons of, they're supplying 36 million kilos of wheat into, let me just drop this down a little bit. Yeah, so supplying 36 million kilos of wheat into the local market at a price of $7.20, right? So here, essentially we have this rectangle that represents the revenue that Turkish manufacturers are able to enjoy before they remove the tariff. So at $7.20, they're going to sell 36 million kilos of wheat into this country. So keep that in mind, right? So if you want to calculate, essentially if you want to calculate the area, by the way, represents the revenue, right? So it's just equal to 36, which is the base, multiplied by 7.2, and that's going to be whatever that is. So we come down here and we say, okay, 36 million tons at 7.2 at $7.20 equals 259.2 million US dollars. This is how much revenue that the local Turkish manufacturers are earning before the removal of the tariff. Now let's go back up to the diagram over here. Once we do remove the tariff, I'm going to use a different color. Once we do remove the tariff, then what's going to happen is that Turkish producers are going to be producing 30 million kilos at $6, because that's now the new world price, right? So they have to produce at that price if they want to remain competitive in their own market. So essentially what's happening is that area has now shrunk. So we no longer have 36 by 720, we have like a base of 30 multiplied by 6. So go down to the calculation bit over here. So after the removal of the tariff, we can see that they're now the Turkish manufacturers are now making 180 million US dollars in revenue. In terms of the delta, right, in terms of the change, so it's a delta TR, the change in revenue would be equal to 180 minus 259.2, which is a loss, right, negative 79.2 million US dollars. Now, we're not quite there yet. We still have to calculate the change in Turkish lira. So we have to, as a last step, we have to convert this US dollars into Turkish lira. So 79.2, I guess, US dollars. Well, how do I do this? One Turkish lira is equal to 0.134 US dollars, or 0.134 US dollars is equal to 1 Turkish lira. So here, if I had 79.2 million US dollars, and I want to convert that to Turkish lira, I divide by 0.134. So here I'm going to go 79.2 million divided by 0.134. That's going to give us 591.04 million Turkish lira. So that's going to be the ultimate change over here, which is in Turkish lira. So 3 marks for answering this question. Probably get couple of marks for doing the main calculation, which is that delta in total revenue, and you'll probably get 1 extra mark for converting that final US dollar figure into Turkish lira. Okay, all good. Let's move on. Okie dokie. All right, just over here. Now, what we have here is we've got a table. So table 4 shows the income tax rates in Turkey for 2020. Sure. So what we have here is we've got these this list of annual incomes from 0 to 22,000, 22,001 to 49,000, 49,000, etc., etc. And then we've got these things called marginal income tax rates. So for that first bracket, so this first bracket, we call that a bracket, between 0 to 22,000, the marginal income tax rate is 15%. Between 22,000 to 49,000, the marginal income tax rate is 20%. And between 49 to 180,000, marginal income tax rate 27%, etc., etc. Now, what this is referred to, this is known as a progressive tax system. The way a progressive tax system works is if the more income you earn, the more tax you pay, not just in absolute terms, but also as a percentage. Yeah? Here's how it works. Let's say if your annual income is somewhere between 0 to 22,000 Turkish liras per year, you would be in the 15% tax rate, or the tax bracket, meaning that if you earn, let's say 10,000, which is in that first bracket, you'd only be paying 15% of your income as taxes. Now, if you progress higher, if you earn more, the next slice, right, if you earn anything between 22,000 and 49,000, then the first 22, you're paying 15% on the first 22. Then on every dollar above 22,000, you're going to be paying 20%. And then if you earn even more, let's say if you get to the third bracket, let's say maybe you're earning, I don't know, like 50,000 Turkish lira per year, then every dollar above the 49,000 threshold, you're going to be paying 27% on every dollar in that, above that lower threshold. Okay, so that's how the progressive tax system works, right? So here, not only are you paying more tax in absolute terms, in absolute dollar terms, you're actually paying more tax in percentage terms as well. So we've got this person, Bacon, and they reside in Turkey and they earn, 955,000 Turkish lira annually. Using information from table 4, calculate the additional income tax that this person would pay if the Turkish government decided to increase the marginal tax rate for incomes over 601,000 to 55%, as it has been in Austria since 2016. Hoo boy. Okay. So, what this question is saying is, currently, this top slice, right, the 600,000 and above, the marginal income tax rate is 40%. So for every dollar that you earn above 600,000, you're going to pay 40%. But if they were to increase that to 55%, how much additional income tax this person would have to pay were they to change this 40% to a 55%, right? So that's essentially what the question is asking, right? Okay, so in order to tackle this question, what we have to do is we've got to first calculate the income tax before at 40%, and then after, so once at 40%, and then we'll do it again at 55%, and then we'll see how much additional tax the delta, and that's going to be the additional tax that this person has to pay. Okay, that's the strategy moving forward. Now, let's say we're doing the original 40%. How do we calculate the income tax that this person earns? What we do is, so here in these little red brackets, I have written the width of the interval, right? You can think about it as like buckets, and these are the different sizes of the bucket. So in the first interval, we can see it's from 0 to 22,000. So that interval, that bucket, has a size of 22,000. This second interval, right, the second bucket is from 22,001 to 49,000. So we can just approximate that. If I just go, let's say 49,000, 1, 2, 3, minus, let's say 22, 1, 2, 3. I know it's 001, but let's just keep it as 22 for now. So that bucket, or that interval has, that interval has a size of 27,000. If I go to the third one, the third bucket is like 49,000 to 180. You can see what I'm doing here. So if I go 180, 1, 2, 3, minus 49, 1, 2, 3. That third bucket has a size of 131,000, and so on. So here's how the calculation is going to work. If this person is earning 955,000, then they're going to pay the full amount, 15% of this first bucket. They're going to pay the full amount, 20% of the second bucket. They're going to pay the full amount, 27% of the third bucket. They're going to pay 35% of the fourth bucket. And then the amount that's above 600,000, the slice, right? If we go, that's from 600 to 955, that's about 355,000 additional Turkish lira that this person's earning. That's the slice that, and on that slice, they're gonna have to pay 40%. Okay, so I'll show you what I mean. Okay, let's go down and I'll show you the calculation. I'll show you the whole thing. Okay, so here I'm saying this is the income tax before. So here we're gonna pay. Remember, we have to pay 15% on that first bucket. That first bucket, that first interval is 22K. So we're going to pay 15% on that first interval. So you can, I'll just use a different color. Let me get rid of some of this highlighting. So what I'm trying to say is that you got to pay 15% on that first interval, the full amount. Because this guy's earning 955,000, so the first 22K he's covered that easily. So he's going to pay 15% on that first 22K. Then on the second, I'm going to use a different color. On the second interval, he's going to be paying 20% on the second interval, which is 27K. So we add that bit in. Then the third interval, he's going to be paying 27% on the third bucket, which is 131, and so on and so forth, until he gets to the final bucket, the final slice. Now the final slice is anything above 600,000. So he's currently earning 955. So how big is that third slice, that final slice? It'll be 955, let's just keep it in, whatever. Oh, all right, what's 955,000 minus 600, 1, 2, 3. So that final slice is 355,000. And he's gonna have to pay 40% on that final slice, which is why over here I've got 40% on the final slice, which is 355K over there. And so once we input this into the calculator, if we had gone, for example, I went 0.15 times 22 plus 0.2 times 27 plus 0.27 times 131, blah, blah, blah. If I were to do that calculation, we would end up with a final figure of 333.07 thousand Turkish lira that he has to pay in income taxes. Now, this is using the old tax brackets, the one where the top marginal rate over here is 40%. So the total tax before is this amount, 333. Now, the next bit of the question we have to do is we got to figure out what the tax would be if, sorry, let me just get rid of this annotation over here. Now we're going to change this 44 slice, this top slice, this 40% slice, to 55%, because that's what the government is proposing. Now the useful thing here is that all the remaining brackets, right, the 22,000 bracket, the 27K bracket, all those previous brackets, they stay the same. So we don't actually have to recalculate those first four brackets. Here's what I mean. So let's say the first bracket is like 15% on the 22K. That stays the same. We're not going to recalculate that. The second bracket being the 20% on the 27K, again, that stays the same. We don't have to recalculate that. So we can actually recycle a lot of the previous calculations. The only bit that does change out of all of this is this top slice. It's no longer going to be 40%. In fact, it's now going to be 55%, which in percentage terms is 0.55. So you can see I've kind of highlighted that change in the color blue. Now, if we were to redo that calculation, we would end up with a final tax, excuse me, a final tax of 386,000 386.32 thousand Turkish lira. So the extra tax that he has to pay would be this figure would be that figure 386 minus 333. That's the additional tax that he's got to pay, and that's going to be 53,250 lira. So that's how much extra tax that he would have to pay were they to change this top slice from 40% to 55%. Okay, so 2 marks. Probably get 1 mark for doing the before and after calculation of income taxes, and another mark for doing the delta, the change in taxes. But if you're able to do the before and after calculation, then you should definitely be able to do the additional tax calculation, because that's just an extra step to get your final answer. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so this next question is about the Lorenz curve. It's a Lorenz curve question. So if you are not super clear what a Lorenz curve is, or you don't really know how to do Lorenz curve / Gini coefficient, you should probably pause the video, go back and revise, because I'm going to proceed on the assumption that you kind of sort of know what a Lorenz curve is. Okay, so table 5 shows the income earned by different quintiles of Turkey's population for 2017. So here, the lowest 20%, these are what we call quintiles, by the way. So the lowest 20%, they earn about 6.2% of the nation's total income. The second 20%, they account for about 10.8% of the nation's total income. The third 20%, or third quintile, they account for about 14.8% of the nation's total income, etc., etc. Now, so what do we have to do? We have to use the information from table 5 to construct a fully labeled Lorenz curve diagram for Turkey in 2017. So what the heck is a Lorenz curve? Well, a Lorenz curve is basically a graph on simple XY space. Now, on the horizontal axes, we have the cumulative proportion, and on the vertical axes, we have the cumulative income. And we can actually get this information from the preceding table. What we have to do is, as you can see here in the table, we have to modify the table a little bit. I've created an extra column for the cumulative. I've created an extra column for the cumulative percentage. Right. So the way this works is, the cumulative percentage of income. So the way this works is that first quintile is going to be 6.2%. So therefore, the cumulative amount is 6.2%, right? So everything from 0 to 20, the lowest from 0 percentile to 20 percentile, they're going to account for 6.2% of total income. Then for the second quintile, they account for 10.8% of total income. But on a cumulative sense, if I go 10.8 and I go plus 6.2 from the previous quintile, we're going to have a cumulative of, let me just clear this stuff away. We're going to have 10.8 plus 6.2. That's going to be, they're going to account for 17%. So if I go 6.2% from the previous plus 10.8% from the current slice, we're going to get 17%. And we keep going in this fashion, right? And I go, okay, well, for the third quintile, they earn 14, they account for 14.8%. But if I accumulate that, I go 17% and plus another 14.8 plus 14.8, that's going to give you now 31.8%. And then if I go to the next quintile, well, the fourth quintile, they account for 20.6% of income. But on a cumulative basis, if I go 31.8 plus the 20.6, we're going to have, so we go plus 20.6, we're going to have 52.14, right? So what we've done is we've now created this extra column. We call that cumulative percentage, and that's going to give us this running tally of what, the cumulative percentage is, right? Okay, so from here, the cumulative percentage, they're going to represent the, so this is essentially going to be the y-axis, I guess. And this quintile here, they're going to represent the x-axis. So if I were to graph this on a two-dimensional space, the quintiles, they're going to be down here, they're going to be on the x, and the cumulative percentage, these ones over here, they're going to be on the y, on the vertical axis. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, by the way, one additional thing that we need to do with these Lorentz curves is we need to graph this thing called the 45-degree line of equality. So the 45-degree line of equality is basically this hypothetical line that shows us what a perfectly equal society is going to look like, what a perfectly equal society would look like. And simply put, it's called a 45-degree line because it's 45 degrees. Okay, so from here, I'm going to now graph the first coordinate. So the first coordinate is, let me just go back up. So the lowest quintile, this slice over here, this bottom 20%, they account for 6.2%. So the cumulative percentage of income is 6.2%. So if I go back to my graph here, so this 20%, they're going to have a coordinate of 6.2. Now 6.2 is like around here somewhere. So I'll just, it doesn't have to be exactly accurate. I'm just going to plonk it down as long as it's kind of roughly accurate. So that's going to be the first coordinate. Then for the second coordinate, the second 20%, the cumulative percentage is 17%. So the second 20%, this second 20% over here, they're going to be, what did we say, it was 17%. So 17, if we trace it over, what direction? It's like roughly over here somewhere. Right, that's going to be 17%. Then for the third quintile, that's going to be like 31.8. So let's go back down. 31.8 is like, what do you reckon? Like it's over here somewhere. Then for the next one, it's going to be 52.4. And so 52.4 is like, so that's around here somewhere, yeah? So 52, we go over here. That's the 52 coordinate. Get rid of that line, it's a little bit unsightly. And then the final quintile being the highest 20%, well, they're obviously going to count for this for the final slice, which is, that brings the cumulative up to 100. Oops, so that last coordinate's going to be over here somewhere. Okay, so what we then do is we now just connect the dots, and that's essentially what the Lorentz curve is. So if I go bloop, 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 and over here, it doesn't have to be exactly to scale, but there you go. That's what the Lorentz curve looks like, and that's how you collect your full marks. So the only real tricky bit, I would say, is the fact that you need to construct this additional column over here to represent the cumulative percentage of income, and then from there, it's just a matter of graphing these two things in XY space, connecting the dots as you saw, and Bob's your uncle. So 2 marks for this, probably, yeah, you get a full 2 marks. Well, so this thing's worth 2 marks over here. Don't forget to label your axes because that's really important. I think you'd easily lose maybe half a mark, even 1 mark if you didn't label your axes properly. And then the remainder of the marks would come from just, you know, plotting those coordinates and then connecting the dots. Okay, let's move on. Okie dokie. So here, table 6 shows selected tax revenue sources and the Gini coefficient for Turkey, Austria, Germany, and the OECD average. Okay, so that's quite a lot of, I guess, information in this table. So table 6, so what am I looking at? So we're looking at different countries, Turkey, Austria, and Germany. And these columns go like personal income tax, corporate income tax, and indirect taxes. And these are percentages of total tax revenues. So for example, in Turkey, their indirect taxes account for 40.5% of total tax revenue. So let's say I had $100 in total tax revenue, 40 of those dollars are coming from this thing called an indirect tax. Okay, so that's what this table represents. And then finally, we've got this thing called the Gini coefficient, and you guys should know that the Gini coefficient is a number between 0 and 1 that represents the amount of income inequality that exists in the country. And when the Gini coefficient is closer to 0, it means that there is less income inequality, which means that we've got quite a flat society. There's not a whole lot of difference between the richest person and the poorest person. Everyone's kind of on the same level. Whereas if you had a Gini coefficient that was closer to 1, it means that we've got quite an quite an unequal society where the richest person is like super duper rich, like way more like richer than the least richest person, right? So we obviously want to, well, depending on your point of view, I don't know, but I think the generally accepted thinking is that we want countries to have a lower Gini coefficient because that means that there is less income inequality, right? We want more equality, not less of this stuff. Okay, so that's what this is showing. So for example, Turkey's got a Gini coefficient of 0.4, which is not great when you consider the other countries in the sample, like Austria and Germany, that have much lower Gini coefficients of 0.28 and 0.29 respectively. Remember, closer to 0, the less inequality, and the closer to 1, the more inequality. So if you want a more equal society, then you want to look for one where the Gini coefficient is less, smaller, right, closer to 0. Okay, so let's go ahead and have a look at the actual question. So the question is telling us to use the data from table 6 to explain why a greater reliance on indirect taxes compared to income taxes for revenue collection is often associated with a higher Gini coefficient value. Right, so what they're saying here is, look, if we just look at this table, we can see that there appears to be a correlation between indirect taxes as a percentage of tax revenue and the Gini coefficient. So, for example, in Turkey, indirect taxes account for 40.5% of tax revenues, and they have a Gini coefficient of 0.4. Okay, big deal. So what? Well, if we compare it to Austria, Austria has much lower indirect taxes as a percentage of tax revenue, and they have a much lower Gini coefficient of 0.28. And it's the same thing with Germany, right? Germany has even less indirect taxes, right, 27%, and they also have a pretty low Gini coefficient of 0.29. And in fact, if you look at the OECD average, it's about 32.1% of indirect taxes, and the OECD average Gini coefficient is 0.32. So what we see here is a pretty strong correlation between the percentage of indirect taxes and the Gini coefficient. Specifically, the more your country relies on indirect taxes, the higher the Gini coefficient. In other words, if you derive more of your taxes if you derive more of your tax revenue from indirect taxes, then you're going to have a more unequal country. So if you want to equalize the country, you need to have less reliance on indirect taxes and perhaps more on other things like personal income tax and so on. Okay, so that's essentially what this question is asking, right? Because the question is saying, explain why a greater reliance on indirect taxes is often associated with a higher Gini coefficient value. So explain this relationship, right? Why? Right? Why do we have this scenario where higher indirect taxes lead to higher Gini coefficients or more income inequality? Right, so what I've got written down here is I've said a couple of reasons, or the logic for me anyway is as follows. Indirect taxes, for example, a VAT or GST. So VAT, by the way, stands for value added tax, and GST is a goods and service tax. It's the same thing. You know, it's basically a tax on all things, right? So if you buy, food or clothing, or haircuts or whatever, you're gonna have to pay the same percentage of tax. Like everybody's gonna pay this, right? So an indirect tax is the same and applied to all households, regardless of income. So it doesn't matter if you're rich or you're poor, you're all going to pay the same indirect taxes. So let's say, for example, if you had a VAT of 10%, then the richest person pays 10% for, tax for like milk and eggs and cheese. And the poorest person is also going to pay 10% tax on bread and milk and cheese, right? The same 10% tax. Whereas progressive income taxes require higher income earners to pay proportionally more tax. As their incomes rise. Therefore, a greater reliance on indirect taxes will lead to greater income inequality and higher Gini coefficient. So what we're saying here is that under a progressive income tax system, the more you earn, the more tax you pay, not just in absolute terms, but as a percentage of your income as well. So if you use more indirect taxes, you're going to have more income inequality because progressive taxes actually flatten that income inequality, whereas it's not so much the fact that you use indirect taxes, it's more the fact that you don't use progressive income taxes. So for example, Turkey's indirect taxes account for 40.5% of tax revenues, and it has a Gini coefficient of 0.4, whereas Germany's indirect taxes account for 27%, and it has a Gini of 0.29. So the evidence is pretty clear, right? More indirect taxes lead to more inequality. So if you want to fix your inequality, then use less indirect taxes and perhaps more progressive income taxes. Okay, so let's move on. Right, so in the second part of this question, the following information was published in the United Nations Development Program 2016 Regional Human Development Report, Inequalities in Turkey, blah, blah, blah. The Human Development Report reported that Turkey's gross national income, or GNI, per capita ranks at 50, while its Standard Human Development Index, HDI, rank is lower at 62. Turkey's Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index, IHDI, score is almost 16% lower than its standard HDI score. The share of public expenditure on education is 2.9% of gross domestic product, while the average share of public expenditure on education is 4.9% of GDP. Among other high human development countries, even among low human development countries, the average share is 3.6%. Identify one reason for the difference between Turkey's GNI per capita ranking and its HDI ranking. Okay, I feel this question's I'm not sure why they asked you this question, but it's kind of like they ask you the question, but they give you the answer at the same time. So, okay, to put things into context, if you don't know what an HDI is, HDI stands for Human Development Index, and it's a number that kind of represents quality of life and standard of living in a country. So you obviously want a high HDI. Countries that have a high HDI tend to have better quality of life, better standard of living, that sort of thing, whereas countries have a low HDI, perhaps life, ain't as great in these places. Okay, so here they've clearly stated that the share of public expenditure on education is 2.9% in Turkey, and Turkey has a relatively low income adjusted HDI. So by the way, inequality adjusted HDI. So the inequality adjusted HDI shows the HDI that has been adjusted for any kind of inequality. So if you have a country that has an equality issue or where it's very unequal, you're going to have a low IHDI score compared to a country that did not have as many equality issues. So here they've said, look, Turkey's inequality adjusted HDI is almost 16% lower than its standard HDI score. So they're saying that Turkey has this inequality issue, that's this problem relative to other, let's say, OECD or developed nations. In Turkey, that you've got that the high income earners earn way more than the low income earners. So we have a potential inequality issue. At the same time that this is happening, Turkey's expenditure on education is only 2.9% of GDP, whereas in other countries it's relatively higher, let's say 4.9, even 3.6%. So why do we have this, right? Why do we have this this difference between its GNI per capita and its HDI ranking? Well, the answer is in the question itself. It's to do with the expenditure on education. So here what I've written is, Turkey's expenditure on education is low, 2.9% of GDP relative to other countries. For example, high HDI countries spend approximately 4.9% of GDP on education. Education is associated with upward social mobility. So if you as a country spend more on education, then, the moral of the story is better education or better access to education leads to better social outcomes. And I think the answer or the reason why is kind of self-evident, right? So here the thinking is, well, if you spend more a more educated person has a better chance of getting a higher income job, and therefore, progressing sort of further up on this on the socioeconomic scale, and you have better life outcomes. So education is kind of the key for a country, for a nation, to flatten the income inequality, right, and to allow people from lower socioeconomic statuses to move up to higher socioeconomic status. That's what we call social mobility. So education, higher expenditure on education is associated with upward social mobility, and that's exactly what I've said in the answer to the question. So it's just the one marker, and so I think that's all that needs to be said. Don't really think we need to elaborate any further. So let's move on. Okay, so in this second part of this question, part B, we've been told to use the text/data provided and your knowledge of economics to recommend a policy that the government of Turkey could introduce to reduce income inequality. So here we have to recommend a policy, right? Not multiple policies, just one policy, and we have to run with it. So I think the good news, and it's worth 10 marks, right? It's worth quite a bit. But I think the good news is we don't really have to, you have to think about like a dozen different things. We just only have to think about one thing and one thing only, and just sort of explain the thinking behind that. All right, so now you can go in any number of ways. There's a whole bunch of policies that you could potentially go with. For example, you could say education is an important way to reduce income inequality, or you can, there's a whole bunch of directions that you can go in. For me, I think that the easiest one to explain would be this idea of progressive taxation. So the thing that we just looked at before, I think one of the earlier questions was with this idea of progressive taxation, where the more income you earn, the more tax you pay, not just in absolute dollar terms, but in percentage terms as well. So if we're looking to reduce that income inequality, then I think progressive taxation could be the easiest one to explain. I'm not saying that's the best option here. I'm just saying that it's the easiest one to explain for me personally. Okay, so this is what I've written for. This is my take, right? So here I've said that progressive taxation, increasing the progressivity of taxes, involves implementing a system where higher income earners pay a larger proportion of their income in taxes than lower income earners. This policy aims to redistribute income, thereby reducing inequality. Right? So if you want to reduce inequality, then the answer is simple, right? You take more wealth from the richer people and you redistribute it to the lower income earners, right? Or rather, you tax the lower income earners less, and this will help to flatten that inequality. Okay, so what else have I written? So that's the opening paragraph, right? So that's to say, okay, this is what I think it is. Now, in the following paragraphs, we're going to explain our position. And I'm going to so remember, we have to use our knowledge of economics. So here, we're going to have to try to draw upon as much economic theory and terms and models as we can to try to explain this. And so I'm going to be relying mainly on aggregate demand and supply, although we can draw on other things as well. Just because I think aggregate demand and supply is a useful model to try to explain how progressive taxation works. Okay, so let's see what else I've got written down here. Progressive taxes reduce the post-tax income gap by transferring resources from wealthier individuals to fund public goods and services that benefit lower income groups. These funds can support education, healthcare, and infrastructure, addressing structural inequalities that limit upward mobility. For example, enhanced educational funding can improve human capital, enabling low-income groups to access higher-paying jobs. Investment in education can also improve labor productivity, increasing aggregate supply. Right, so here I've highlighted some of the key words in blue, right? So I've said that we've gone that, okay, if you use progressive taxes, right, you can transfer resources from wealthy individuals to fund public goods and services. And these public goods and services, like for example, education, and more education leads to this thing called the accumulation of human capital, which is a key concept in sort of aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and it improves labor productivity, which in turn will improve aggregate supply, right? So it will shift the aggregate supply curve outwards. So here you can see we just have to try to pepper or sort of put in as much of these references to sort of core economic concepts as we can. So furthermore, by increasing disposable income for low-income households, this policy could stimulate consumption. According to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, consumption is a major component of aggregate demand. Lower income groups have a higher marginal propensity to consume, so redistributing income towards them could boost aggregate demand, thereby fostering economic growth. Right, so again, this is where we're going to bring in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply stuff. Remember that one of the four components of aggregate demand is made up of four components: consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports. And consumption is the biggest component of aggregate demand. Typically, over 50% of aggregate demand is consumption goods. So if you increase disposable income for lower income households, for example, through progressive taxation, then you're going to put more dollars into the pockets of lower income households, who will then use that dollars, they're going to use those dollars for consumption. So they're going to go out and they're going to buy, more of the things that they need to survive, and that's going to help boost aggregate demand, and that's going to grow the economy. Now, just to kind of like finish off, this policy must balance equity and efficiency. Excessive taxes on high income earners could discourage investment and labor supply, potentially slowing economic growth. Given Turkey's challenges with inflation and economic instability, a carefully designed progressive tax system complemented by investments in education could help reduce inequality without stifling growth. Policies should be designed to stimulate both aggregate demand and aggregate supply to reduce inflationary pressure. Right, so here we're saying that as a counterpoint, okay, just don't, yes, progressive taxation is good, but don't go overboard, right? Because if you go too far with this, if you make the progressive tax system too progressive, then that's going to discourage investment, right? So people are going to go, well, or that's also going to shorten labor supply, because you might even have this scenario known as brain drain, where high income individuals, which are the most well-trained, most mobile, might actually say, well, forget this, why would I stay in this country if they're going to tax the heck out of me? I'm going to get out of here, right? So that's going to reduce labor supply, and that's going to slow economic growth. So, so I suppose what we're saying is that just to as a counterpoint to this idea of progressive taxes, yes, progressive taxation is good and potentially can solve our income inequality issue, but we also have to be careful not to go overboard, and we have to carefully design this thing so that that it complements investments in education and other infrastructure things to promote growth rather than stifle it. Okay, so 10 marks for this question. There's really, the main sort of takeaway from this is really to work in as much of your knowledge of economics as possible into your solution. I find that the ones that score well are the ones that have that, bring in as much of your economic theory as possible. So like things like aggregate demand, aggregate supply, human capital, labor productivity. These are all things that indicate to the examiner that you're actually answering this question within the wider economic framework. Yeah, so that's sort of it's my key takeaway from how to answer these big, long questions. Okay, so that about does it for this video. That's a wrap. Thanks for sticking around. Hope you guys found this useful. See you guys in the next one. Thank you.